Okay, I want to welcome everybody to another presentation of the North Carolina Masonic Research Society. And this is a presentation I'm really excited about. Brother Joe Martinez, we all know him, we all love him. It's more or less a love-hate relationship. But no, we all love Joe. He is Senior Warden of Manassas Lodge up in Manassas, Virginia, the founder of the Mid-Atlantic Esotericon, which is coming up June 25th. So, Joe, I believe there's still time to register for that, correct?
July 25th, yep.
All right, terrific. So if you have not registered for the Esotericon, I was there last year. It's brilliant. Please sign up for it. You will not regret it. And Joe is going to give us a presentation on the Osirian mythos and its ties to Freemasonry. So this is incredibly intriguing. So, Joe, whenever you're ready, it's all yours.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, everybody, for coming. Matt, if you could do me a really quick favor, since you're the admin, if you could unmute everybody for 2 seconds so that we can sing you all happy birthday. And there he goes. He's doing it. Hurry up, Matt. All right, so if everybody can unmute their mics, we're going to sing happy birthday to Matt on the count of 3. 1. Cool. Well, thank you for allowing me to do that. And with that, we will go ahead and get started. If anybody has any questions, put them in the chat box or just save them to the end. Those of us on Facebook, go ahead and put your questions in the chat box, and Matt or I will be sure to answer them. And I'm going to go ahead and, Matt, I can't share my screen. It says disabled. So you can just look at my face the whole time.
No, we don't want to do that.
Or we can watch Tom Bridges eating a salad or whatever the hell he's eating right now. Hell is that?
Scalloped potatoes, man. You know I ain't eating no salad.
All right, cool.
Okay, good.
Let's get cracking. Alrighty, let me close this window so it's nice and small. Alrighty, well, thanks again to everyone for joining. Matt, I see your face. Can you hear me okay? And can you see my screen? All right, right on. Cool. So today we're going to talk about the Osirian myth and its connections to Freemasonry. So let's start by saying that it will be very difficult to condense 4,000 years of history and mythology into a 30 or 40-minute presentation. But we're going to attempt to do our best to meld it all into one cohesive package as quickly as possible. The creation myths and the myths of Osiris are very familiar to those who have never read or heard those stories. They've just been told to you in different and altered forms over hundreds and hundreds of years. The story of creation, the story of a slain king, and the story of a lost secret has been repackaged and reinvented across the centuries. And although slightly different each time, it still has the same markers of each retelling. And that makes it easy to see that these stories span the borders of nations as well as the divisions of millennia of recorded history. And, there we go. Oop, sorry, I'm trying to get my ugly face off here so you guys can see. So the first thing we're going to do is take a brief second to discuss how we're going to use the term mythology in this presentation. So the term mythology has a negative connotation in the modern sense. People nowadays use the word to describe magical and false tales of the past with no historical or cultural significance. And that really just isn't true. At its face, the word mythology, when it's used by scholars, is the original intended meaning of the word. And taken from the Greek word mythos, which literally means story of the people, it means the study and interpretation of often sacred tales or stories of a culture known as myths, or the collection of such stories which deal with the various aspects of the human condition. So the word mythology can be used to discuss all different types of stories. It can discuss the stories of the Jewish tradition, the Islamic tradition, the Christian tradition, or the Egyptian tradition, or any other religious system. It doesn't have to have that inherent negative or make-believe connotation. So what we're going to discuss today is a brief history of the Egyptian mythology, the different places where it came from within Egypt, the story surrounding the creation of the world, perhaps how it's similar to some other stories you've heard in the past, the story of the first god king Osiris, his transmission of knowledge and science to the world. We're going to talk about his life, his death, his rebirth. And again, we're going to touch on how this story influences many tales that came later, what that means, and how it should resonate in part with the modern Freemason. I hope that you will find something of interest to you in the next 30 minutes. So to begin with ancient Egyptian history, one has to look at the pre- and proto-dynastic periods. So that's from about 10,000 BCE to around 3,200 BCE. And then the rise of the different major city centers of ancient Egypt. The proto-dynastic period was marked by these major additions to human civilization. The first hieroglyphs that we know of, the first use of stone palettes for communication, the regular use of serex or early cartouches, the first royal cemeteries, and the invention of advanced sail navigation. All this stuff happened during the pre-proto-dynastic period. So from this transmission of written language, we find numerous creation myths, and most notably the myth of Osiris, which arose in a few different major branches across the entire kingdom of Egypt. So you have to understand that the overall construct of what we now call the ancient Egyptian religion arose in different pockets a little bit differently across all these major city centers in the civilization of the entire Egyptian kingdom. Depending on which family reigned, which gods were given more credence and importance, and which area held more political or priestly power, these major city centers were originally known as Kemenu, meaning 8 town, Iunu, meaning pillars, Inebu-Hadej, meaning the white walls, and Waset, the city of the scepter. So these varied stories of creation and the birth of the Egyptian dynasty did have some major commonalities across these different periods in Egypt and places in Egypt, and were later merged into more or less unified religious story by the Second Intermediate and New Kingdom time periods. If you want to know what those periods are, you can ask me after. It's also of note that with the rise of the Ptolemaic dynasties, original Egyptian religious ideas were ultimately merged with Greek culture and religion, and in my opinion, heavily watered down for the rest of Egyptian history. So the first one we have is Iunu, also known as Heliopolis. So Heliopolis is the Latinized form of the Greek word Heliopolis, meaning city of the sun. So Helios, the personified and deified form of the sun in Greek, was identified by the Greeks with the native Egyptian gods Ra and Atum, whose principal cult was located in that city. The city also appears in a lot of the Old Kingdom pyramid texts as the House of Ra. Next we have Inebu-Hadej, also known as Memphis. Memphis had many names during its history of over 4 millennia of settlement. Its ancient Egyptian name was Inebu-Hadej, which means the white walls. Memphis became the capital of ancient Egypt for over 8 consecutive dynasties during the Old Kingdom. And if someone's not on mute, if they could mute their line, that'd be awesome. So the city reached a peak of prestige under the 6th dynasty as the center for the worship of the god Ptah, the Greek god of creation and artwork, which later replaced the Ogdoad in other Egyptian myth narratives. And we're going to get to the Ogdoad shortly. Ancient sources and documentation suggest that the white-walled city was found by Menes, the first king of unified Egypt. So that's the first dynasty of Egypt that unified Lower and Upper Egypt. And I said king because they weren't known as pharaohs yet. Pharaoh was a Greek word that wasn't really used until the New Kingdom time period. So it was likely that Menes, the first king of the United Egypt, established himself there to better control this new union between those two rival kingdoms that were joined under his rule. Next, we have Waset. The Egyptian name for Thebes was Waset, which meant the city of the scepter of the pharaohs. Thebes was always a major city center in ancient Egypt, and it contained the famous Temple of Luxor, the traditional temple for king-making ritual. And it was the capital of the kingdom on and off for many, many centuries. And finally, we have Kemenu, or Hermopolis. That was the Egyptian language name of the city and meant 8 town, after the Ogdoad. So the Ogdoad were a group of 8 primordial deities whose cult was situated there in that city. The city was later named to the city of Hermes, or Hermopolis, since the Greeks identified Hermes with the Egyptian god Thoth, because the city was the main cult center for Thoth. And Thoth was the Egyptian god of magic, healing, wisdom, and the patron of scribes. Many of you have seen pictures of Thoth because he's awesome looking. So what the Ogdoad are and what they mean is a good segue into the ancient Egyptian creation narrative. One of the most popular Egyptian creation myths, the myths coming from Hermopolis, or Kemenu, start with the Ogdoad. The Ogdoad were also known as the Infinities, and they were the celestial rulers of the cosmic age, the age before the world. They were considered to have come long before the Egyptian religious system currently recognized today, and the Ogdoad were concerned with the preservation of that celestial world, and later, as we'll see, the formation of the human race. So, though their power among the Egyptian people was most notable during the Old Kingdom period, so around 2700 BCE to 2100 BCE, traces of this pantheon did make its way down to the next set of gods. So it's very similar to the story of the Titans in Greek myth. They were the older gods, and they kind of sort of went to the wayside as the newer gods, the Olympian gods, came to power. So the Ogdoad predate the more commonly known Egyptian gods, like we said, such as Osiris, Isis, Anubis, and so on. They were considered to have come into creation before the world did. So before anything we knew existed, the Ogdoad existed. And they consisted of 4 couples, 8 deities who balance one another and the nature of the cosmos itself. So each pair correlated to one of the primordial forces of creation in the Egyptian belief system, like water, air, light, and the concept of time. So the 3 primary pairs, Nu, Nanuet, Hehu, Hehut, Kekui, Kekuit, they were always named as such, no matter where those names were taken from in hieroglyphic form. The 4th pair had different variations. The most common of these was Amun and Amunet in place of Ker and Kerhet down at the bottom there. In the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt, it was believed that Nu and Nanuet were responsible for the development of the primordial waters of the universe. Primordial water sounds a bit familiar to us, doesn't it? So Amun and Amunet were caretakers of the air, and Kekui and Kekuit were the keepers of darkness. And finally, Hehu and Hehuet, the last pair, were responsible for maintaining eternity and infinity. Each first name in this set corresponds to the male avatar, while the second is always female. You can see how similar their hieroglyphs are. But what that did was it created an equal balance of gender in this early pantheon and these early primordial forces. That's a very enlightened concept. So there's several views from the Egyptians that succeeded the time of the Ogdoad as to how the world they knew came into being. The most popular was that the Ogdoad created an egg in the primordial waters from which the world was born. It was considered to be invisible because there was no sun, so you couldn't see it. Also sounds familiar to some folks. Until the day that the cosmic egg hatched and out came the brilliant golden light of the newly born sun. This form of the sun was named Ra, one of the only Egyptian deities to have been accepted both by the Ogdoad believers and the later religious systems of the time. So Ra, or Atum, was that common focal point between 2 different religious systems that occurred in ancient Egypt. So we have these pre-existence deities, and it is at this time in the story most of the popular myths converge across all those different city centers with the story of the actual creation of the world and mankind. So for the rest of the story, we're going to focus on the most popular meldings of these characters, those being Ra, Atum, and Amun, all become interchangeable depending on where and when you lived in the ancient Egyptian kingdoms. So now we come to the most common story of creation, and we're going to use Atum and sometimes Ra in this story. So that's really loud. So once upon a time, before there was land, fish, land animals, or human life, there was this great expanse of primordial water that encompassed the entire universe. Nothing existed in these primordial waters since the beginning of time, until this great egg appeared in the water. This cosmic egg, we know, and we've heard in other mythologies, contained Ra, or in other places Atum, who represented the daytime sun. Once his egg hatched, he burst forth into the universe and took his place as its ruler. In other narratives, the journey began with the creation of the world and the universe out of darkness and swirling chaos. Once there was nothing but endless dark water without form or purpose. Or in other words, a formless void. Now, where have we heard that before? Existing within this void was the god Heka, the god of magic, who awaited to have the moment of creation. So out of this watery silence, rose the primordial hill known as the Benben. And if you've seen any of my other talks, you know I talk about the Benben. But it's basically the first spot of creation that rose from the primordial waters. And it's symbolized in a lot of Egyptian architecture on the top of obelisks. So you'll have a pyramid shape called a pyramidion that symbolizes the Benben. And that's basically means the first piece of land that sprung forth from the primordial waters of creation. And lots of obelisks had them. And in their heyday, they were usually capped with gold. But that gold was since stolen by the time we got to them. So we have the Benben, and upon which stood the great god Atum, or Ra. So Atum looked upon the nothingness of the universe and recognized his aloneness. So through magic, he mated with his own shadow, since there was no one else, to give birth to two children. And those two children were Shu, god of the air, who Atum spat out, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture, who Atum vomited out. And I did see Adam Goldman here, so I have to say it. So in other versions of the story, Shu was still spat out, but Tefnut was masturbated out. So little sex magic there for Adam Goldman. So Shu gave the early world the principles of life, while Tefnut contributed to the principles of order. And we're going to take an aside for a second and talk about why order was so important to the Egyptians. So this order, which would become known as Mat in the Egyptian language, became the overarching theme of the entire Egyptian kingdom society. Mat represents the ethical and moral principle that every Egyptian citizen was expected to follow throughout their entire daily lives. They're expected to act with honor and truth in matters that involve their family, their community, their nation, the environment, and even the gods. So the significance of Mat developed to the point that it embraced all aspects of existence in the Egyptian culture, including the equilibrium of the universe, the cycle of the seasons, when the Nile rose and fell, heavenly movements, religious observations, and honesty and truthfulness in social interactions with everyone around you. So back to Shu and Tefnut. So leaving their father on the Benben, they went out to create the world. So in time, Atum became worried because his children were gone for a very long time. So like all good fathers, what he did was he removed his eye and sent it out in search for them. So while his eye was gone, Atum sat alone on the hill in the midst of the chaos and contemplated eternity. So Shu and Tefnut returned with the eye of Atum, which was later associated with the eye of Ra, or the all-seeing eye, or eventually the eye of Horus. And their father, grateful for their safe return, shed tears of joy. These tears that dropped onto the dark, fertile earth of the Benben, or that first spot of creation, gave birth to men and women. So yay, human beings. So these human beings had nowhere to live, so Shu and Tefnut mated and gave birth to Jeb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. Jeb and Nut, though brother and sister, fell deeply in love and were inseparable with one another. So Atum found Jeb and Nut's behavior very unacceptable and pushed Nut away from Jeb high up into the heavens. So these two starstruck lovers were forever able to see each other, but were no longer able to touch. Interestingly enough, Nut, the goddess of the sky, forms a starry deck canopy over her husband, the earth. This also sounds familiar to the earth and the heavens being separated in other creation narratives. But before they were separated, old wily Jeb and Nut, they conceived and later had 4 children. So they had 2 sons and 2 daughters. The sons were Set and Osiris, and the daughters were Isis and Nephthys. Like their parents and their aunt and uncle, they fell in love too. Osiris and Isis fell in love, and Set and Nephthys fell in love. So now we're going to turn to the pyramid text of the Pyramid of Teti in Saqqara, where we pick up one of the most comprehensive narratives of the Osirian myth. So after their grandfather Ra passes on from this plane, Osiris was called to succeed Ra as the ruler of the universe. He became the god of fertility, agriculture, vegetation, and life, And soon after, we'll soon see, he also became god of the afterlife, resurrection, and rebirth in ancient Egyptian religion. So after his coronation as ruler of the universe, he traveled to the world, bringing science and agriculture and language to all corners of the globe. As with many other religions with initiatory rites, a transmission of divine knowledge was done so by Osiris, and he was credited with bringing civilization to the human beings created by his father Ra or Atum. He married his sister Isis, who became queen of the universe and his consort. Set was brother of Osiris. I know that picture's stupid, I apologize. So Set was brother of Osiris and god of the deserts, storms, fire, war, envy, disorder, and a whole bunch of other nasty things. Set and Osiris, however, did not get along after Osiris was chosen to succeed Ra. Set did not like his brother becoming master of all creation and felt that he should be ruler instead of his brother, where we heard a similar story to this before. His anger was fueled further when Osiris made plans to depart to spread light and science throughout the world. So he made his sister/wife, Isis, regent of Egypt, instead of bestowing the power to his brother Set. So Set had a really terrible temper, and he vowed to kill his brother and take the power that he considered to be rightfully his. Upon Osiris's return to Egypt, Set plotted to destroy his brother. Set secretly took measurements of Osiris's body while he slept one night and had a beautiful cedar wood and ebony chest made just for the occasion, fitted to Osiris's exact specifications. He then announced a banquet honoring Osiris's return to all of the Egyptian pantheon and invited all of the gods to this feast. So at this celebration, he unveiled a beautiful chest and offered the chest as a gift to anyone who could fit inside it perfectly. So just as Set planned, none of the other guests could fit into the chest, and some of the pyramid texts say that 72 people tried. Cool number. Before Osiris then tried, and he was the only person left to try and get into the box and fit inside it. So when he laid down in the chest, which was made to fit him exactly, Set and his followers slammed on the lid and nailed it down. He then sealed it by pouring molten lead into the cavities and threw the chest into the Nile River. So this act of murder of the king really upset Isis, who couldn't bear to be without her beloved Osiris. Isis's grief was so great that her sister and Set's wife, Nephthys, helped Isis search for her king. So while they were out searching, Set usurped Osiris's rule and reigned over all of the land of Egypt. He neglected the gifts which Osiris and Isis had bequeathed to all the people, and the land suffered drought and famine and all these other horrible things. The chest was swept out to sea and landed on the coast near Byblos. The instant it touched the land near Byblos, a huge tamarisk tree sprouted up to protect it. So this tree grew so large that the king of Byblos saw it, had it chopped down, and fashioned it into a pillar in his palace. Isis tracked down the body to Byblos and begged the king to give it to her. Notably and interestingly, this pillar that contains Osiris was also known as the Jed pillar, which you've seen in other Egyptian artwork, which symbolized the spine of Osiris. Here you see it with the crook and the flail common to the first god king Osiris. So she took her husband's corpse back to Egypt and communed with Anubis to prepare the body for mummification, the very first mummification. But before that could happen, they left the body unattended. Set stole the body of Osiris and became so enraged that he dismembered the body into 14 parts, or different pieces, and scattered those body parts all throughout the land of Egypt. So obviously Isis is even more distraught than she was the last time, and she again enlisted the help of her sister Nephthys. They found all but one of the pieces. The missing piece was, of course, what, Adam? Let's see if he says it here in the chat. I'll say it for him. It was the phallus, which was apparently swallowed by a fish sacred to Set. So Isis and Nephthys mourned over the dead body of their brother, and Ra took pity on them. He sent Anubis to prepare Osiris for the first ever mummification and instructed Thoth, the god of wisdom, Isis, and Nephthys to piece the body back together. So where was I? Sorry. So Isis, Nephthys, and Anubis pieced the body back together, and Isis transformed into a small bird, or a kite, as it was called, and breathed life into him. But it wasn't sufficient for him to take his place back among the living. but it was enough to give his body life, enough for her to conceive a son through a magical sexual union with Osiris. And that's what you see depicted there. You see Isis as the bird, and you see Nephthys and Thoth, and the pre-mummified body of Osiris. So the child was born and hidden from Set, and his name was Horus. Osiris revived, but could no longer rule among the living or even be among the living because he was no longer whole, because he was missing his phallus. He would have to descend to the underworld and reign there as the Lord of the Dead. Osiris left for the underworld, and Isis went into hiding in the delta region of Egypt to protect herself and her son from Set. So Isis gave birth to Horus alone in the swamps of the delta. She hid herself and her son from Set and his demons in the thickets of the Nile Delta, only going out at night for food, accompanied by a bodyguard or two. And Isis and Thoth nurtured Horus and educated him in their exile until he grew to manhood and was strong enough to challenge his uncle for his father's kingdom. So once Horus grew to adulthood, he returned and confronted the Egyptian pantheon about his heritage and challenged his uncle for the right to reclaim the throne that was rightfully his. Sometimes this contest involved a challenge of minds or wits transforming into other animals, where, like you see here, where he transforms into a hippo. In others, it involved Horus slaying Set and losing an eye, and Set losing his phallus. And that eye would later become the very famous Eye of Horus. In another still, Horus would defeat Set, not slay him, and Set would ultimately find redemption by sailing on the sun barge with his father, Ra, to fight the serpent Apophis each and every night. So that's a hieroglyph of Apophis and Set. So Ra was the god of the sun and the god of order and the god of light. And while Apophis was the lord of chaos and night, Ra would have to battle Apophis every single sunset to start a new day. So having conquered Set and restored order, Horus became known as the uniter of the two lands, the lower and the upper kingdoms of Egypt. He reinstated the policies of his parents, rejuvenated the land, and ruled wisely. It's for this reason that all the kings of Egypt that succeeded from the first dynasty period onward aligned themselves with Horus and took on a Horus name to rule under as their coronation and initiation ceremony. So there was a ceremony where the human soon-to-be king became Horus. Osiris had been the first king of Egypt to establish order and then passed on to the underworld, while Horus was the king who restored order that was overturned by Set, his uncle, and who raised Egypt up from chaos to harmony. So you have these concepts of order and chaos and harmony, a lot of concepts that you see in Hermetic rites and principles. So Egyptian kings from then on, therefore, identified themselves with Horus in life and Osiris in death. So during their reign, they were the physical manifestation of Horus. And at the moment of their death, during their burial ceremony, they traveled to the underworld to join with Osiris. So back to Osiris, instead of coming back to life fully, as we said, he traveled to the underworld, which was a dark and desolate place. But his father Ra assured him that he would find peace and contentment as the king of the dead. And his son Horus would rule over the living until the time that Ra chose to unmake his creation and return everything to the nothingness from whence it came. And thankfully that hasn't happened yet. But 2020 is still out. So when Egyptian kings passed on, they would travel after being properly prepared, using the proper rituals, to the land of the dead to sit with Osiris. Similar ritualistic practices would assist the new king-to-be to transform from man to God-man in the form of the new Horus. So again, there's that dual practice or rite in the king-making ceremonies of ancient Egypt. The king, a physical personification of Horus on earth, would reign as the Horus. Upon his death, he would undergo a ritual where he would be prepared for his journey to the underworld. And during that time, which most oftentimes took 70 days, his heir would undergo the ceremonies needed to transform him into the new Horus. This really established that divine right of rule that was inherent in the Egyptian dynasties all the way up through the Ptolemaic period. Excuse me. So let's talk about some themes that we see in the Osiris story and how that's similar to themes that we find in other stories with maybe some Freemasons may be familiar with. We're going to talk about the allegorical concept. So you have the concept of what allegory is and how it's important to both stories. We're going to talk about a tragic murder that's occurred in each one, some hidden wisdom or secret that is imparted or not imparted, multiple burials, more than one burial of one person. We're going to talk about the transmission of knowledge during an initiatic rite or practice. And then finally, we're going to talk about the search for something lost and why all of that is important to us and what it means. So for those of you that think I'm making a lot of this up, we're going to refer to Mackey. And Mackey brings us his thoughts on the ritualistic mysteries of Egypt and their connection to craft masonry. So in the 1875 edition of the Mackey Encyclopedia under Egypt, Mackey writes, and I quote, "Egypt has always been considered as the birthplace of the mysteries. It was there that the ceremonies of initiation were first established. It was there that truth, first veiled in allegory, and the dogmas of religion were first imparted under purely symbolic forms. From Egypt, the land of the tongue globe, the land of science and philosophy, peerless for its stately tombs and magnificent temples, the land whose civilization was old, and a nation before most other nations. Since then called an empire, this system of symbols was disseminated through Greece and later through Rome and other countries of Europe and Asia, giving origin through many intermediate steps to that mysterious association which is now represented by the institution of Freemasonry." And that was Mackey, not Joe. So let's navigate through some of these themes that we find in both systems. So Egyptian mystery rituals and modern Freemasonry. We're going to talk first about the concept of a trinity of people who play a central part of each story in these epic allegories. And again, allegory, for those who don't know, is the expression of truth about the human existence by means of symbolic figures and their actions. So in the Osirian mythos, we have Osiris, we have Isis, and we have Horus. Those are the three central figures. In Freemasonry, you have Solomon, king of Israel, Hiram, king of Tyre, and Hiram Abiff. Excuse me. So next we have a tragic murder. So both of these stories, the story of Osiris and the story of Hiram, involve a tragic and sudden murder before their time. The antagonists in these stories have their own reasons for committing that murder, whether it's envy or greed or spite. Then we have secret mysteries and knowledge. So there's hidden wisdom that's kept by our protagonist in each story. Osiris keeps the secrets of the universe, of science, of enlightened wisdom, only to be passed on through the mysteries to his successors. And Hiram, in the speculative craft, keeps the secrets of a master mason, neither one imparting them before their untimely death. So now burial and reburial, multiple burials. Both protagonists experience multiple burials. Osiris is first buried in a chest, then dismembered, then undergoes the first mummification required to complete his rebirth. We have in earlier Masonic documents the reburial and secrets of Noah and his three sons, which some of you are familiar with. And if you haven't heard that story before, go read the Grand Manuscript. And then we also have Hiram, who was hastily buried and then reburied according to the Masonic customs of the age. We then have a transmission of knowledge at the point of resurrection. So Osiris, through the magic of Isis, transmits his secret knowledge, as well as his seed, to give rise to his son Horus, who is the culmination of that. There were also initiatic practices for the hierophants, or priests, as they prepared to do the work of the gods. If you sat in Jamie Lamb's presentation about his book, he talked about hieroglyphs and hierophants. That means priests. So hieroglyphs is priestly writing. In the other story, Master Masons know at which point in the allegory they receive the secret wisdom, or at least are shown the doorway to the beginning of this secret wisdom. So initiation rites flourish in both of these stories. For Osiris and for Horus, there's that initiatic rite where each deceased king merges with Osiris, or makes that journey to the underworld, and then, the afterlife. And the new king-to-be undergoes the secret initiation of not only king-making, but really God-making, or apotheosis. So in Freemasonry, the rites of initiation are meant to prepare us for a life not of the mundane, but of the celestial or the miraculous. So there is that small similarity there. Then we come to the search for something lost. Both allegories contain a treasure lost forever with a substitute at the end until the real treasure is discovered. So if we ask Adam Goldman, who's here, the something lost would have been the magic phallus as the thing lost to him in the Osiris myth. But I think it's really the divine right to rule and the apotheosis of man, which is lost, and it's reclaimed by Horus and all of his kingly descendants through that practice of initiation and king-making. So in Freemasonry, we know what is lost and what is substituted in its place, leaving us with a lifelong quest for the rediscovery. So what does it all mean for us? It means that there is absolutely some symbolism that we should take from the stories of Egypt and her mysteries when discussing Masonic purpose and practice. Transmission of these practices survived in a vacuum for thousands of years, then permeated Hellenized culture once Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, and then migrated to Roman culture and was passed in hushed corners to future initiatic systems from the Dark Ages to the Age of Enlightenment. The most striking things to me after researching a lot of ancient Egyptian rituals that we found are the similarities that we find that are glossed over in ritual and practice each and every day in Freemasonry. Excuse me. So we have the slain hero who takes with him a secret or knowledge to the grave and who receives a gift from a goddess, most notably a virgin. Osiris was slain and Isis came along, put his pieces back together. She also had to restore him with a golden phallus, as most of the legends say, as his brother Set had destroyed the other one. The phallus here was the gift of the goddess, or the gift was divine birth of the sun. So some people think it's the golden phallus as the gift. Some other people think that the divine birth of Horus was the actual gift so that they could carry on the dynastic rule of all Egypt. But this gift shows up in many other forms, and in some cases in a more phallic form in other legends that we see. So the stories of King Arthur also show how he was defeated and his sword was broken. The Lady of the Lake gave him a new one, the famous Excalibur. He then went on to complete his hero's journey, as legend tells us. And it's funny because actually the symbolism is quite consistent in this legend, as the Black Knight also lost his manhood at the end of this tale. Then we come to Percival. Percival, as the new young knight, seeks out the Grail. When he visits the castle of the wounded Fisher King, he sees a lance in the Grail. The lance here is another gift in phallic form, and the list goes on and on. Finally, we come to the story and grave of Hiram Biff, the twice-buried son of a widow who kept a secret close to his heart, which caused his untimely death and set into motion a discovery for that which was lost. Be it a word or a formula or some divine secret entrusted to a select few, Hiram takes with him to the grave this secret knowledge in the face of death and is rewarded with a raising and reburial, which culminates his journey of birth, death, and raising. This raising ceremony completes the monomyth saga for that character and begins our search for truth and light, things we refer to as wisdom and enlightenment in Freemasonry. So one of the most striking similarities, or dare I say connection between the two, is this most famous of Masonic symbols, first committed to print in the early 1800s, which clearly shows a striking similarity between the story of Hiram and the story of Osiris, if you know what you're looking for. So what do we have here? If we ask Albert Pike in Morals and Dogma, he would tell us, and I quote, "Masonry still retains among its emblems one of a woman weeping over a broken column, holding in her hand a branch of acacia or myrtle or tamarisk, while time, we are told, stands behind her combing out the ringlets of her hair. We need not repeat this trivial explanation given of this representation of Isis weeping at Byblos over the column torn from the palace of the king that contained the body of Osiris, while Horus, the future god of time, pours ambrosia on her hair." Finally, we have the circumstances of the rebirth or resurrection. So Hiram's hasty grave was opened and he was reburied in a place of honor in full Masonic ceremony, as the legend tells. He was raised in a very particular way, using a very particular manner or ritual, which is performed to every Mason that goes through the degrees. Coincidentally enough, the body of Osiris is raised on the 7th day after his death, which is symbolic in most solar myth stories. And he was also raised in the sign of Leo, or the lion, which should strike us Freemasons as being very, very, very familiar. So the Osirian myth is about the redemption of the soul. It includes archetypes that are consistent in lots of other major systems of initiation. You have a king with the wisdom of the universe, imparting it onto the world, who's cut down by jealousy and greed at the very height of his power, unable to complete his task. Through a mystical ceremony, he's given new life by Isis, who is able to revive him long enough to conceive an heir and guarantee her husband's place as the Lord of the Underworld. Most notably in this is the fact that Isis conceives her son after the death of her husband, which really effectively makes Horus the son of a widow, doesn't it? We then go to Synesius, who was a Greek Christian bishop in the early church, and he points out that there was evidence enough of elaborate and secretive king-making rituals, initiation that would take a man or a woman and transform them into the personification of Horus on earth. So that's coming from Christian documentation. Plutarch also notes in his essays on the Egyptians that from the conflict of Osiris and Set, we're to understand that there is constant warfare between the constructive and destructive principles of our nature. So the struggle between dark and light, good and evil within ourselves and the world without. So Osiris becomes that prototype for order and beauty and harmony, and Typhon or Set is that disorder and asymmetry and inharmony. Brother Manly Hall also describes the Egyptian mysteries as containing the ancient allegories found within Freemasonry. The phallus, then, is the lost word. He notes that the phallus, being the symbol of the vital power, is so used in Egyptian hieroglyphics. There's phalluses everywhere in Egyptian hieroglyphs. You're welcome, Adam. So that phallus, again, is that lost word which is not discovered, but for which a golden replica is substituted. This replica produced the divine child Horus, who completes the hero's journey for his father. He also notes that the greatest minds of all antiquity all made the trek to ancient Egypt to learn the mysteries and the sciences, such as Thales, Solon, Plato, Democritus, Pythagoras, and Plutarch, just to name a few. And this was something that would not have been done by so many if there was little more than mysticism and card tricks to be found there. So Osiris's journey from creation, life, death, and rebirth is really that story of at-one-ment or atonement with the absolute, that search for light that people still make to this day using different practices. So there's that search for the divine in all of us and the divinity that's all around us. And that path was laid before us in conscious thinking man, for me, at least as far back as the time of Isis and Osiris. And that concludes my presentation.
Well, Joe, that was fantastic. I appreciate that. So many lost penises. That's a little disturbing.
I did that all for Adam.
Yeah, but I appreciate that. If anyone has any questions for Joe, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. For those on Facebook, post your questions in the comments, and I'll be happy to ask. In fact, Joe RJ does have a question here. He asked, where did it go? RJ asked.
Yeah, I'm trying to read Facebook, but there's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot. But he said, Joe, have you read anything from Herodotus in approximately 485 BCE visiting Memphis? He is purported to have been shown the ancient Hall of Kings, 345 wooden statues, which were kings before Menes. If you've heard of this, any insights?
All that I know about Herodotus was that he wrote he basically wrote the book on the first history of Egypt, according to his time, and he held it in a very revered place. And he wrote about their festivals and things like that, and basically about the mythology. But I did not read anything about kings before Menes. So if RJ's here, if he can regale me with his wisdom, that would be dope.
You're supposed to make me smarter, Joe. No, so it's just passing references I've read in a few different books where they're referencing Herodotus visiting 470 or whatever 485 BCE. He goes deep into a tunnel. They show him this row of kings. And then they say, and these are the kings from before. And they're these wooden statues, 375 or 85 or something like that. And something like they say that he says, well, these are wonderful statues. And he says, well, they're not really statues. These are the kings. They split one from another through a process of parthenogenesis from plant life to human life. And
So we're talking
this,
about plant people gods.
yeah, and then that's the second part of my question. Was interesting that you had shown Osiris as green in some of those images.
Great point there. So yeah, if you notice in any of the colored hieroglyphs that there are, most notably inside of tombs, because the stuff outside didn't, it didn't last in terms of coloring. Osiris is the only deity in Egyptian culture that was not, normal colored if he wasn't an animal. So he was the only one that was green. And the reason why that was is because, number one, he was Lord of the afterlife and also the god of agriculture and life. So since green is that nature color, you have that plant aspect there. So that's why Osiris was green in all colored hieroglyphs.
That's awesome, man. Thank you.
Yes, and if you don't know what we're talking about with the plant people, go read Secret History of the World by Mark Booth.
Yeah, that's actually, I was like, where was I reading the initial stuff before you read this book, Secret History of the World, and it's great, but it's terrible at the same time. He doesn't give like a lot of reference. It's just like, hey, let me just push through and tell you all this great stuff. And then you have to go find it on your own. You don't know where he's pulling anything from. So you have to do a lot of research. But in a passing statement, this is what he says. You all right if I read this quick couple sentences? It says, this is where I pulled this from, like I said, where I went and looked in a few other sources, I did find reference to this. So he's not just pulling out of his butt. But he says, in approximately 485 BCE, or he just says BC, Herodotus visited Memphis, Egypt. There in a vast underground vault, he was shown rows of statues, former kings stretching back as far as the eye could see into almost unimaginably distant times. Walking with priests along rows, he came to a series of 345 colossal wooden carvings of beings who had reigned before Menes, the first human king. These beings, said the priests, were born one from the other, that is to say, without need of a sexual partner by the plant-like method of parthenogenesis, each carrying a plaque giving name, history, and annals. The wooden monuments were a record of a long-lost era of the vegetable life of humankind. Then they go into like mandrake roots and things, but really bizarre stuff. Interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, that is super interesting. I'm going to have to whip that out again.
Page 89.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question not related to plant people?
Hey, Joe.
Yes.
No, go ahead. Someone else was about to speak up.
No, go ahead, Parth.
Oh, I was going to ask, so in terms of end-of-life rituals, if you could provide sort of any sort of insight in terms of the Egyptian versus, for instance, sort of like what the Native Americans do, right, where they put them up on posts, and they sort of leave them so that nature can reclaim them, versus sort of what they do in my part of the world. No, I'm not talking about Missouri, but cremation is the standard sort of operating procedure there. But just sort of how those different ideas interact.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can't speak to Native American or what they do in Missouri in your neck of the woods, but I will say this. The concept of the Egyptian afterlife was central to all of their funerary practices, right? They honestly believe that you took your body with you to the afterlife, right? So that process of embalming or mummification, the saving of organs. If you guys have watched the History Channel, you know they would remove organs without tearing up the body, without leaving a scar, and they would remove a lot of your vital organs, the brain, the heart, the liver, and keep them in canoptic jars. And all this stuff went with you in your burial chamber. And then they also had another ceremony. I think I had a slide for it with the opening of the mouth. So since they believed that your body still functioned and you took it with you to the afterlife, you would still need to speak and you would still need to eat. So after that 70-day process of mummification, what you were left with was a very well preserved body that was ready to make the journey to the afterlife. And it was different for people who were kings or pharaohs versus your common folk, right? Because your kings had a very specific journey. They were going on an astral journey to the afterlife to sit and reign with Osiris in the afterlife. Everybody else, you know, they just made the trip to go see their family and stuff. You kind of get that nice heaven analogy, but they don't get to rule alongside with Osiris. But the Egyptians absolutely believed that your body went with you after death, so it was not destroyed. In fact, it was sacrilegious to do so. I believe it was up until the time of the Second Intermediate Period, or the New Kingdom. And by the time of the Ptolemies, they started to make stuff up, right? They started to merge their Greek deities with Egyptian deities, and that's where you get gods like Serapis, who is just a huge conglomeration of all of them. And that's where Egyptian mythology just starts to go completely sideways. So sorry for you Greek folks, but they kind of messed stuff up. If that answered your question.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate it as always.
Hey, any other questions?
Joe, I just want to mention, I didn't hear you bring this up unless I missed it. I heard you mention Mackey, but Albert Pike also wrote that into the 24th degree of the Scottish Rite. In fact, the second half of that 24th degree really is reenacting the search for Osiris's body. And it really mirrors our third degree quite closely as well.
It does. I did quote Mackey in one when we were talking about the Weeping Virgin. But as I started looking into that, and I was reading, I think it was Manly P. Hall, when as soon as I saw that Horus was the son of a widow, I was like, oh man, I was like, that just did it for me. So, but yeah, Pike does write about the Weeping Virgin quite a bit, and the analogies there or the similarities there are really, really striking to me.
Joe.
Yes.
Did you cover where Mott came from? M-A-A-T?
Yes, I know. Yes, Mott. There's a little comment there too. So Mott, she was personified as a deity eventually, right? And that's why you have she was a deity. I think I had it in my slideshow. She has a pretty little feather in her hair. So Mott came from the separation of order and chaos at the creation of the world. So that first underlying order of all existence was Mott, and that was basically used as a bookmark for daily living throughout the Egyptian culture, right? Everything centered around Mott, even at the time of their death. So I showed a couple of older hieroglyphs about it, but I didn't go into it. So once you saw first... what's it called? Once you travel to the afterlife, what would happen is you would have a scale. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen the scale there. And you normally have Osiris, the Lord of the underworld there. And your heart would be put on one side of the scale and the feather of Mott would be put on the other side of the scale. And the way the legend goes is if you traveled to the afterlife, if you were dead, and they weighed your heart, and it was lighter than the feather of Mott, then you lived a good life, full of order and full of right living, full of Mott, quote unquote. But if you didn't and your heart was heavier than the feather of Mott, then there was either an alligator or some other animal that would devour your heart and you would disappear immediately and you wouldn't get to go to the afterlife. So they're really considered Mott or that order or that right living a big part of their life. And it permeated everything, just how you dealt with people, how you dealt with your own family, how you dealt with the government, and so on and so forth. It touched all parts of their culture, at least through the time of the New Kingdom, because that's when you start getting some weird stuff happening in Egyptian culture, is New Kingdom and then the Ptolemaic period. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Hey, Joe, thank you. I have a question about, I don't know if it's connected, obviously, but it's not something you covered, but you kind of touched on it there with the soul getting eaten if it's heavier than the feather of Mott, and you can't go on the afterlife. I mean, I've heard that the ancient Egyptians, and I don't know if this is true, believed that the immortality of the soul is not a guaranteed thing.
It was not. You had to go through, and the journey to the afterlife. The guttural way we've translated these pyramid texts is called the Book of the Dead, right? But that's not really its title. It's basically a list of instructions for all the things you need to do to make your way to the afterlife. And it's a set of questions, it's a set of rules, it's a code of conduct. So it wasn't a pass. Once you died, you automatically made it to the afterlife. You had to basically pass a series of tests or challenges or questions to then ultimately sit in front of Osiris and have your heart read.
Right. It's kind of creepy, though. I wish.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish we all just had an immortal soul. We didn't have to worry about all this, but I don't know. I don't know.
Joe, it's Jamie.
Yes, sir.
I like how you brought up first a comment. I like how you brought up the major themes of that narrative, of that myth, and how those have been sort of used in initiatory traditions probably since Mackey in his symbolism of Freemasonry, he finds four of them. He finds aphonism, which is the disappearance and search. There's the pastos, which is the putting in a grave or a cave or the underworld. The euresis, which is sort of the discovery, just like Eureka, I have found it, the euresis. And then the final sequence is the autopsy, where everything is brought to complete realization. And, of course, like as you pointed out, we see that in the Osirian cycle. We see it in the story of Jesus Christ. We see it in Christian Rosenkreuz with the pastos. We see it, of course, with our central allegory in Freemasonry, and even Persephone in the Eleusinian myth. She goes to the underworld. There's a sort of search or an aphonism by Demeter. The one thing I wanted to ask you was, did you find anything sort of it came to mind, and I had never read this anywhere while you were talking. You talked about the Odoad being sort of these pre-deific entities, right? They were sort of, I guess, elemental or very basic cosmologically or cosmogonically, I guess. And do you find anything relating them to the Titans in Greek mythology, whereas the gods would be related more to the Neteru or the deities who were the next?
So I kind of made that leap in logic myself just from having read. So from what I read from the Ogdoad, they were all pre-creation, right? So they existed before and how the Egyptians marked that creation was the creation of the world. So they were pre-existence, swimming around that primordial water. I didn't read that anywhere. I made that connotation of since the Titans were more pre-creation of man and earth. The Titans obviously had a crappier story with their children. They didn't get along so well. But what I did note was that belief or worship of the Ogdoad started to decline over periods of time in Egyptian culture. So after the Old Kingdom, they were pretty much, relegated to myth, as strangely as that was. Whereas your Ennead were the primary gods, and you really started with Ra or Atum at the top. So I kind of made that connection myself and didn't actually read it anywhere.
Oh, one follow-up on that. You talked about, what was it, Ra, Atum, and then Amun, right? Now, Ra and Atum are obviously solar, but Amun you find later in Jupiter Amun and Zeus Amun, etc. You find that more jovial or Jupiterian thing. Was there a division between the Ra and Atum, sort of vis-a-vis the Amun?
I don't know about division, but depending on which city-state, quote-unquote, had their religious practices, that would determine who was the head god, because Amun was one of the Ogdoad, but he also became a solar god at some point. And I don't remember exactly when, but I can get you that answer. But from the myths of Hermopolis and the myths of Heliopolis, you get mostly Ra and Atum, Amun in some versions of the pyramid texts. But again, the one I worked off of was the most comprehensive. That was the Pyramid of Teti, which was Old Kingdom pyramid texts. And that contained the most comprehensive story. And the weird thing is, there is no one single place anywhere in Egypt that they found yet that has the complete story from start to finish. There's broken pieces in every single one of them. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but that's what I read.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, man.
And Joe, Jeremy asked over in the chat, are the Ogdoad the original reptilians?
Well, smartass, if you...
That's for you. I know you like ancient aliens and stuff, so
Well, strangely enough, they were mostly depicted as frogs. So I will say amphibian people.
Well, weren't the men the frogs and the women were serpents or something?
I think something like
that. Yeah. But
yeah.
Reptilian.
Kind of, sort of. I'm not answering that.
Well, I have heard many women refer to men as toads. So, yeah.
So it goes way back.
I'll just say, Joe, wonderful presentation tonight. I love the way that you went into some of the archetypal stuff and then married it with some of the Masonic stuff and obviously some of the Book of Genesis and all that. The other thing I was thinking, well, first, maybe one comment is you did a My Big Fat Greek Wedding thing and said that Pharaoh came from Greek, where I don't know that I'd say that they come from the Demotic, where it means big family, para, and maybe
or house.
Yeah, the big house. I mean, big
it meant house. Yeah, it meant great house. Yeah.
But I think the Demotic might have preceded it, but to go to what Jeremy said, and what you responded about the soul being destroyed, I say that we see some of these things, and the themes made it into Christianity as well. You already mentioned the one about the non-carnal union or the first virginal birth, right? So it was no penis, a reed of the Nile or a golden phallus created Horus, but the other thing that I was thinking about. Above Jesus' head in the crucifixion, it has the INRI, which we normally associate with Jesus Nazarene Rex Judeum, right? Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. But there's a Masonic / occult interpretation, which gets to the whole idea of the souls that didn't make it. And it's ignis naturae renovatur integra, which is through fire, nature is renewed. So those souls that didn't quite make it, they became the foodstuffs of the later seeds. And then one last comment, just Robert, that's cool stuff. The stuff from Herodotus, I read it a while back, but I know that along these initiatic lines, I believe there was quite a bit of information that said that actually the pyramid, the Great Pyramid of Giza of Khufu, was really just the tip of the iceberg. But what is below the whole thing is this labyrinth that he wrote about, and so the priesthood of Amun-Ra hid that, but all the initiatic stuff was actually below ground in this labyrinth, and people would get lost in there and die. But among those were these ancient figurines of the gods or statuary. But anyway, just to keep the conversation going, because this is such an awesome topic and you did such a great job, Joe.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Joe, I would say I would just echo Adam's sentiments. But I wanted to say two places that you can find some information outside of just this book by The Secret History of the World. It's Mark Booth, but that's just his pen name. It's something else. Anyway.
Jonathan Black.
Yeah, there you go. There's a book that's called The Structure of Herodotus and you can get it on JSTOR. So if you still have your student ID, do that. Another one is actually, it's really weird. It's kind of vague, but it's named it's the account of Egypt by Herodotus. Not too far into it, he talks a little bit about that, for what it's worth.
Oh, yeah, it's on JSTOR. And I don't have a login. Thanks. So if somebody who's a student can, find that and make it show up on Facebook, that'd be dope.
Got you.
Joe, if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen really quickly.
Please.
We were talking about the weighing of the soul, and that's one of my favorite images out of ancient Egypt. And so this, of course, depicts that weighing of the soul. And you see over here Mot's feather weighed against the heart. But then we were talking about, what happens to the soul if the heart is heavier than the feather. And you have this demigod, Amat, who's part crocodile, part jackal, and has the hind end of a hippo. And he would devour the soul. So there is no underworld, there is no hell or Hades. It's nothing. You either ascend to the duat, or you just cease to exist completely. But I just found that fascinating that you were able to tie that in, and just wanted to share that with everyone.
Well, interesting. This picture you have up here actually doesn't have Osiris in it. You've got Anubis, who would escort people to the afterlife and be their conductor, quote unquote, through all those challenges and stuff. And then you have Thoth there as well, who is the one who's presenting the challenges and things like that as well.
If I'm not mistaken, I'm looking at they've in this picture they've cropped off the top, but Osiris actually is depicted over to the top right with a line of other Egyptian deities here, but his position is thrown to the top right. It's just cropped off in this particular image. So,
Hey,
cool.
Can I add one little thing about your image there, Matt? And maybe Joe has some thoughts,
Sure.
or somebody else. Now I'm thinking it might not be that simple that, if your soul's too heavy or whatever, heavier than the feather of Mot, you get eaten and that's the end. And the reason why I say it might not be that simple of a story is, think of the tetramorph. I mean, we have like an animal here that's mixed with three. And the tetramorph symbol itself is usually astrological, and so could this be symbolizing some other process that the soul has to go through? Not the end, but something that needs a process. Because why is it three animals? What's the meaning there? Where is the soul actually going?
So my interpretation of that is, looking at the Egyptians, if you look at all of the male gods, they have the heads of animals, or their therianthropes, the mixture of man and animal. And that's a very, very common occurrence when people go through hallucinogenic experiences, whether it be through DMT or, things like psilocybin. Extremely, extremely common. In Egypt, they had two sources of DMT. One was the blue water lily, which, if brewed into a tea, was an excellent psychedelic. However, if it was brewed too weakly, you got no effect out of it. If it was brewed too strong, it killed you. So, whoever was brewing that tea had to know exactly what they were doing. The safer bet was the bark of the Acacia melodica tree, which, sometimes referred to as a burning bush. So we're going to have to ask Moses exactly what he was doing out there. But the DMT is really concentrated in the bark, and just a little simple processing it can be smoked and inhaled into the system. So anyway, we know that the Egyptians did this, and what we're seeing there actually might have been what they were seeing on these hallucinogenic journeys in their communications with the gods. Just a theory. I may be totally wrong.
Well, I liked it. I saw some hands raised. Did the folks with hands have? Yeah. Brother Tim with no beard.
I think Brother Clint's hand was up before mine.
Brother Clint with the awesome Golden Girls tarot card set that we all loved.
I asked my question about Mott already. I just forgot to lower my hand. But if you look in the chat, I just added something to what Matt just said, if anyone's interested.
Right on. Thank you, Robert. Tim, what you got, brother?
This is more of a weirdness, I guess, than you know how, just from perspective, in like the Christian religion, sometimes we criticize people for taking a literal view of the books of, included within that library of books, whereas some are poetry and some are history and some are kind of allegorical, and that's the case there. And I think that's the case in a lot of religious texts. And so I'm wondering, because I don't know, and some of these Egyptian mythologies, do we know if they have different categories of stories too, or are all of these supposed to be just taken as a literal narrative?
Well, I can only speak for myself, and I love that question because I did touch on it a little bit. And when I said that, I personally think the Osirian myth is an allegorical one. It really is. Now, did the Egyptians think so? I mean, I don't know, because through most of the Egyptian dynasty, all the way up to the middle of the New Kingdom, and it started to go to crap when when Alexander the Great came, there really was a divine right to rule. And the reason why there was harmony and order is because the people really thought that the person made God and made king was really a personification of Horus, right? And that's why there was that high sense of order throughout everything that they did. I looked at this story purely as allegory. Is there a story they're trying to tell? Absolutely there is. Does it jive with a lot of other stories and initiatic systems that we've seen? Absolutely it does. You talk to that guy in my top left-hand corner named Jamie Lamb, he will absolutely tell you the same thing. There is a common thread, and I hate to use the word monomyth, but it really is, that permeates a lot of these stories. But to answer your question, I looked at it from a purely allegorical sense. What were the themes underneath? Did I believe that, gods became Horus in the flesh? Probably not. But the Egyptians did for a very long time, for 2,000 plus years. Like I said, until the Greeks came and it just all went to crap. So, yeah, absolutely. To your point, agrotheological as well. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's how I looked at it.
It kind of did. I'd always wondered if maybe the priests and the deities, had a different interpretation than the common folk, and maybe there was deeper levels of understanding. But I don't know. I'm guessing the average person was probably not in there reading the tombs either. Your average Homer Simpson in Egypt.
Well, I mean, and Jamie talked about this in his talk on his book. Hieroglyphs were the writing of the priests. The priests were probably the only ones that read, besides them and royalty. And Jamie, chime in if you think different, but your average common Egyptian person was not a reader. They probably listened to stories orally like most other folks did. But that writing was exclusively written for the gods and was read only by the priests. But like I said, Jamie, chime in if you disagree.
And I had one follow-up question, and I really am hesitant to ask this, and it's kind of unrelated, but how in the hell do you make these presentations, like the graphic parts? You buy service?
I'm a PowerPoint wizard. Yeah, I love me the PowerPoint, and you can thank 13 years in corporate America for that. But yes, but actually, someone did have a question, and let me ask it. So the question was, Joe, what thoughts do you have about the Junior Warden's jewel and its role in the third degree as related to the phallus of Osiris? I absolutely love that question. So without getting into the ritual itself, your 3 stationed officers represent, Solomon, Hiram King of Tyre, and Hiram Abiff. So for those of you who know what jewels they wear, I find it really interesting that the plum is the one worn by the Junior Warden, and it does have a very interesting connotation when we're talking about the second part of the Master Mason's degree, and I will leave it at that. So I absolutely think that is interesting there. But again, I really like the way Mackey describes how the mysteries kind of intertwine with Freemasonic symbolism. You know what I mean? Just to throw it out there, and those who know me know this, I really don't think that speculative Freemasons ran into operative lodges just to give them, grips and signs and words and stuff like that. I think there was a lot more important stuff that was going on. And conversely, I really don't think, and I think I saw Don here before, if he's still here, would love to hear his thoughts about, I don't think operative Masons really needed to have grips, words, and signs to prove they were Freemasons. Like if you were a shitty Freemason, you would know it. You would have really garbage work, and people would throw you out and not pay you. But, I guess if you had an extra secret word, that would, signify that you really did know your stuff. But I don't think that was the case, when they were building cathedrals and the like. So, but that's my 2 cents.
It doesn't look like Don is still on with us, but I would have loved to have heard his comment.
I will ask him on Monday when I see him.
All right. Any other questions for Joe? All right. Well, everyone, I appreciate you attending tonight and enjoying Joe's presentation. Joe, that was absolutely fantastic. It was better than I hoped for. I mean, it was
Thank
just
you so much. And happy birthday, man.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And of course, I'm using this little cigar dagger you were so kind to send to me. I appreciate that. I love this. Gets quite a workout. But anyway, everyone, thank you again for joining us. Next week, we have Brother Brent Kalita from State College Lodge 770 in Raleigh, and also he is a member, past master of Zetland Lodge number 83 in Calgary, Alberta. So that will be a very, very interesting presentation on the legend of Solomon as is depicted in the 3 major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So I think that's a very fascinating topic. Hope you can join us for that. I should have the link, an announcement for that posted within the next day or so. But again, thank you for joining, and I hope everyone has a great night.